Well, hey, welcome to Hope Church. Today we're wrapping up the series, Address the Mess. And the question I want you to think about as we get started today is, have you ever made a mess messier? A few months ago, as a portable church, what we do is a little complicated at a time. And in case you didn't know, we're a portable church because we actually have heard stories of people driving into the parking lot saying, when did they build a church here? Oh, a few years ago. We just let the school use it all week long because we don't need the space. But as a portable church, there's a lot we have to set up. There's a lot we have to tear down. Well, one Sunday a few months ago, as we were just finishing up the tear down, I was walking through, kind of giving everything an eye. Not that I know where anything goes, but I still like to walk through like I know. And as I'm walking out that door right there in the back of the room, I noticed there's a little spot of ink right outside that door on the tile floor. And I said, man, I hope we didn't put that spot of ink on the floor there. And I take a step, and there's another spot of ink, and another spot of ink. And I think to myself, uh-oh. And I look down the hallway, and every 12 inches, there's another ink spot going all the way down that hallway, rounding the corner, going into the cafeteria. Well, here's what had happened. A pen had broken, like right over there, and like there was a little pool of maybe that much ink on the floor. But one of our carts, one of the casters, rolled over that little bit of ink on the floor, and every 12 inches it put a fresh smudge on the floor, and we have to be out of the building in 5 minutes. Now, it's so important to us to leave this school better than we found it every week. We just value that. We think the community should be a better place because the church is there, and we're like, oh no, now we've got a mess to clean up. So first, there's a couple of guys, I'm like, guys, we got to clean up this mess. So first we try the thumbnail, that doesn't do anything. That's what dry cleaners do, right? They can't use water, so they just sit there on your curtains. Well, that didn't work. Someone grabs like a paper towel with some water. That doesn't work. Someone comes around the corner and says, hey, the janitor just handed me this cleaner. He says it takes ink off of anything. Squirt, 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 squirt all the way down, start rubbing it off. It doesn't just take ink off of anything, it takes floor wax off of anything too. So next thing you know, we had this mess, we had 5 minutes to clean up, and all we did was make this mess even messier. Now you've got your own story in your life. You've probably made a mess messier. Maybe you had a favorite blouse or a favorite pair of jeans and you stained them, and in your effort to remove the stain, you might have destroyed the clothing. Or perhaps you had on your garage floor an oil spill or a paint spill, and maybe it was originally this big, but the time you were done cleaning it, the stain was this big. You've got your stories of how we've all made messes messier. But what's true of the messes that we make can also be very true of our personal lives. See, all series long, we've been talking about address the mess because something we all have in common, Christian or not, spiritual or not, believe in God or atheist, something that all of us have in common is that all of us have created some messes in our lives. A financial mess, a professional mess, an academic mess, a relationship mess, a marriage mess. All of us have made a reputation mess. We've made messes. But what's true of the messes we make, cleaning up paint, cleaning up oil, cleaning up ink off the floor, all of us have possibly also made our personal messes even messier. Perhaps you had a reputation mess and you made it messier. Maybe you had a marriage mess and you made it messier. Maybe you had an academic mess and you made it messier. See, here's the things about our messes that we don't always think about when we're in the middle of a mess. Every mess comes with built-in bad options. Whatever mess you are facing in your life, you need to be aware, built into your mess, there are some bad options that are guaranteed to make the mess messier. For example, no. Don't apologize. Keep arguing. Don't stop spending. Keep borrowing. Okay, don't tell the truth. Keep covering it up with lies. And every single mess we make in life, or in every single mess we inherit in life, there are some built-in bad options. And if we exercise those bad options, all it will do is it will take the mess that you are in and it will make that mess even messier. As a pastor, when I talk to people, because sometimes people are in a mess, they say, Jason, can I just talk this through with you? We talk it through. And people have said to me so many times over the years, I think I'm at rock bottom now. I think things are so bad, I'm finally at rock bottom, so the only place I have to go is up. And I look at their situation, and I used to just think this, then I started saying it out loud. No, you're not. This can get messier. Because the options you're telling me you want to pursue, Those are options that will make this mess even messier, because in every mess, there are built-in bad options. So today, as we wrap up this series, Address the Mess, I want to share with you some tools to help you keep from making a mess in your life even messier. And to do that, we're going to look at the life of a man by the name of David. He lived about 3,000 years ago. Perhaps you know of him as King David, or perhaps you've heard the story of David and Goliath, or maybe you've just seen the Michelangelo statue of David. However it is, you've possibly heard of David before. And today we're going to look at an episode from his life where David teaches us how to keep from making a mess messier, but instead how to address whatever mess you find yourself in. Now, this story takes place before David was the king of Israel, but we need some backstory in order for the story to make sense. When David was a young boy, perhaps a young teenager, one day a prophet by the name of Samuel showed up at his home and said to David's father Jesse, "Jesse, the Lord sent me to anoint one of your sons to become the next king of Israel." Turned out it's David, but he's still a young man at this point, and it doesn't mean anything. There's already a king of Israel, but God says, "David, you will be the next king of Israel after the current king." And he just kind of wiped his nose and went back to looking after the sheep. But one day, his father Jesse sent David out to the battlefront where Israel's army was gathered, because David had brothers who were fighting men in Israel's army. He said, "Here, take these provisions to your brothers, check in on them, see how they're doing, and bring a report back to me." So David goes out to the battlefront with his provisions. He sees his brothers. Here's some cheese, here's some bread, whatever it is. And he looks out, and the enemy army, the Philistine army, is drawn up against the Israelite army. Now, the Israelite army's on a hillside, the Philistine army's on a hillside, and there's a valley between them, and no one wants to step into the valley and take the low ground. So they're just kind of, they're stalemated against one another. But the Philistines have a champion, a giant named Goliath, and every day he comes out and he taunts Israel, and he taunts the Lord, the God of Israel. And David comes out and says, "Well, he can't talk that way about our God. I'm going to take him down," because David thinks to himself, "Hey, when I defend my father's sheep, there have been bears that have attacked. I take down the bears. There have been lions that attacked. I've killed the lions, and I don't think this giant is any worse than a bear or a lion that I've killed." And if you think about it, that makes David the first Green Bay Packer, because he killed bears, he killed lions. There were no Vikings to attack the flock, but if there were, I'm sure he would have killed them too. So he says, "I can take down this giant." He goes out to the battlefield, he slays Goliath, and David becomes an overnight celebrity. All of a sudden, there's a new hero in the nation of Israel. His name is David. He's instantly drafted into the army. He starts going on military conquest. Soon he's leading campaigns for Israel, and everything he touches, it turns to gold, and people love David, and the army begins to love David. Now, perhaps you've noticed in your life, maybe work or in other arenas, there's someone who holds the title of leader, but then there's someone who's actually leading, and they're not always the same person. That's kind of what's going on in Israel. Saul is the king of Israel, but more and more people are following David. Now, Saul was a very insecure man, and he became jealous of David's popularity, and he began to worry about losing the throne, because there is this rumor going around. David was anointed to be the next king of Israel. God chose him. He's going to take the throne, and Saul was a very insecure man. So he thinks to himself, "I need a plan to get this situation under control." So here's what he does. He takes his oldest daughter, and he says to David, "David, you're a fine young man. How would you like to marry the princess and become a prince and become part of my family? I'll be your father-in-law, David." And David says, "Do you think it is a small thing to become the son-in-law of the king? I'm a nobody from no family. I do not deserve that honor, your highness. I cannot accept your offer." And he says no. And again, David's reputation just grows. Wow, what a humble guy. He's not entitled. It's all about serving others. This guy is amazing. Now Saul's really getting panicked, but then he hears through the grapevine, probably from his wife, his second daughter has an eye for David. And then he finds out David's got an eye for his second daughter. So he says, "I'm going to try this again." He goes to David again and says, "Now don't turn me away a second time. I want you to become my son-in-law. Here's my second daughter. Why don't you marry her?" And David says, "Do you think it's a small thing to become the son-in-law of the king? I come from a simple family, and I don't have the money to pay the bride price for a princess." To which Saul says, "No problem. The bride price isn't money for my daughter. The bride price is nothing more than the death of my enemies. If you kill 100 of my enemies, the Philistines, you can marry my daughter." Because he thinks to himself, this will be perfect. Here's a young man, he's in love, he's going to go out and get himself killed, and that will be the end of David. I don't have anything else to worry about. So David goes out, he kills 200 Philistines, brings back the evidence, and now David is becoming a legend in his own time. He just went out and slew 200 Philistines, and he marries the king's daughter, and she loves David so much, Saul quickly realizes his strategy backfired. She's not going to help him at all, and Saul becomes more and more insecure and more afraid. Well, one day, David is in the palace, and Saul suddenly loses it. He grabs a javelin that was nearby and tries to pin David to the wall with the javelin. David realizes, I need to get out of here. He avoids the javelin, runs out of the palace, and flees for his life into the desert wilderness. A fugitive, an outlaw who never broke the law. Well, while he's out there hiding for his life, there's some other outlaws that start to follow David. He's such a natural leader that the other outlaws say, well, you seem to know what to do. We're going to start following you. And then some of those outlaws had their own wives, and they had their own children, and pretty soon there's this village out in the wilderness following David, and he is in a mess because he didn't create any of this. All he did was the right thing. He just served his country. He served God and country. That's all he ever did. But he is in a mess that Saul made because of his insecurity and his jealousy. Now he's got this incredible responsibility for the lives and well-being of all of these people. David is in a mess. And that's where we're going to pick up the story, because this is where he shows all of us. When you find yourself in a mess, whether you created it or whether you inherited it, here's how you avoid making that mess even messier. Here we go. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, we're told, after Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul's out at the war front. He's coming home. His soldiers are tired, but a scout comes along and says, Your Highness, we saw David. Somebody spotted him out in the desert. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men. These are special ops. 3,000 chosen men from all Israel, and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. Now, that's a spring that's located in a very desolate area of Israel. So the area of En-Gedi, it's a desert region. It's nothing but hills, rocks, a few scrubby bushes, and lots of caves all over the landscape. So if you're an outlaw, this is a perfect place to go and hide. Saul tells the men, well, you're not going home yet. We're going out to hunt for David in this desolate area. Saul, came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. So the whole army's marching out, and Saul, the king, has to use the bathroom. Now, if you're in the infantry, by the way, if you have middle school children and you're looking, how do I get them interested in the Bible? This is a good place to start. So if you're in the infantry and you have to use the bathroom, hey, too bad. You go find a bush and then you run and you catch up. But when the king needs to use the bathroom, halt, everybody stop. We're all going to wait because we do not leave the king behind. So Saul gets off out of his saddle. He wanders into this cave so he can go use the bathroom, check the scores, see what's going on in social media, whatever he does there. And it just so happens that David and his men are in the cave, because apparently one of David's scouts said, David, Saul is coming, and there are 3,000 armed soldiers with him. David looks at his little band of merry men and says, we can't fight them. They will slaughter us, and if they catch us in the open country, they will chase us down. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to pick a cave. We're going to hide in the cave. We will wait for them to pass by, and then we will come out and go in the opposite direction. We will be a ghost. They will never know we were here. So they go find a cave, and they hide way in the back, and it just so happens, of all the times that Saul has to use the bathroom, of all the caves he could have wandered into, he chose David's cave. Amazing that the tension now is set up, the drama is there. Here's what happens. The men said, David's men who were with him said, this is the day the Lord spoke of, when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. So the men surrounding David their jaws drop when they see nobody other than Saul himself walk in, no bodyguards, no security, walking in from the bright desert sun into this dark cave where he can't see a thing, and all of a sudden they go, because they had heard the rumors that David was anointed to be the next king of Israel. And they would sit around the campfire at night and all tell stories, and David would say, you know, God told me there will be a day when he will make me king, and he will deliver all of my enemies into your hands. And the men are like, hey, maybe, maybe not, but hey, we follow you. We're just outlaws, and you're a good leader, and we're doing okay following you. We're good with that. But David, it's true. Look, it's Saul. You can put all of this to bed right now. God has shown up. This is so good, David. Isn't this a God thing? Right? Now, if you're not a Christian, I'm going to make fun of Christians for a minute. Christians, have you ever noticed that when Christians get superstitious, they say, oh, it's such a God thing? No? Okay, anyway, So they say, David, this is a God thing. God, if there was ever a day where God showed up and answered prayers, it's obviously today. Here's the guy who is pursuing you, who is seeking your life, and all you've done is serve God and country, and now you're supposed to be the next king. God has rolled out the red carpet for you to stroll down and become the next king. All you need to do is go slit his throat, cut off his head, take his crown, and you're the king. Oh, David, imagine it. This is going to be so cool. Okay, all those soldiers out there, they just saw Saul walk into the cave, and they're going to see David walk out of the cave with the crown on his head. Oh, it's going to be awesome. This is the stuff of legend, David. God has shown up and answered your prayers today. This is so good. Okay, so they're just excited. This is a good day. Then David crept up unnoticed. Now, this is his sweet spot. This is his wheelhouse. He is a warrior. This is the guy who slaughtered 200 Philistines. This is the guy who took down Goliath. This is in his wheelhouse. This is going to be so quick. All Saul is going to feel is a tug on the back of his hair, and then he will breathe his last breath with a dagger in his throat. This is what David is good at. Now, imagine the emotions he's going through. He's done nothing wrong. God chose him to be the next king. This is what God said, I'm going to do for you in your life. And here we have this jealous, petty, insecure, so some might even argue mentally unstable man sitting on the throne of the kingdom of Israel. And he's pursuing my life even though I haven't done anything wrong. And I can end it all today. I can end the mess today. Every mess I'm in right now, in 2 seconds, I can put it all away. I can clean up every single mess like that. So David crept up, and Saul had no idea what was about to hit him. David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He didn't cut his throat. He cut off a corner of the robe Saul had set to the side so he could use the bathroom. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. And the men around him would have said, "You're what?" Okay, if this bothers your conscience, I've got a dagger. I'll take care of this right now. I will clean up your mess, David. I will address every mess you have right now. But David is conscience-stricken just for cutting off the corner of Saul's robe. And he explains. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid." You're not going to forbid. The citizens of Israel are not going to forbid. No one's going to forbid because everyone would say, I am perfectly justified in taking this man's life, but the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master. David, he's not your master. He's a wicked king who wants to take your life. No, he's my master. The Lord's anointed. God put him on the throne of Israel, not me. Or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. Now, I'm going to pause the story for just a minute and zoom out, because this is where David's story starts to intersect our story. You know that feeling you get in your chest when you're in the middle of a mess? And there's that urgency, there's that fear, there's that worry inside of you that says, I need to resolve this mess. I need to get out of this mess that I'm in. And next thing you know, your primary goal is, no matter the cost, no matter the corners you have to cut, no matter how unvirtuous you have to be, just get out of the mess. Win the argument. Tell the lie. Borrow more money. Get out of this jam. And there's something that drives us to get out of this mess. Here's what David understood. David understood, my goal is not to get out of the mess. My goal is to obey God. My primary goal, would I like to be out of this mess? Yes, but my primary goal is not to get out of my mess. My primary goal is to do the will of my Father in heaven. My primary goal is to honor my Father in heaven, not to get out of my mess. And if honoring my Father in heaven means I'm going to be in my mess a little while longer, that's his problem to resolve. My problem is to do the next right thing that honors my Father in heaven. You see, here's what's at the root of every single mess. Again, whether you caused it or someone else caused it, here's what's at the root of every single mess. A lack of virtue. A lack of godliness. Whether you caused it or someone else, that's what's behind the mess. And just like you do not clean up a flood with more water, you do not clean up an ink spill by pouring more ink on it, you do not clean up a stain by adding more stain, you do not clean up a mess, you do not address a mess by adding more ungodliness to it. You do not address a mess by adding more unvirtuousness to it. That's what created the mess in the first place. And David understood something. Although on the surface this looks like it would take care of all of my messes, I know that doing the ungodly thing and murdering this man that God put on the throne of Israel is not going to address the mess, because at the root of all mess is ungodliness. Yes, he is in the wrong. Yes, he is unjust. Yes, I am innocent. But I will do the next right thing. So if you're taking notes, here's the fill in the blank I put in your program. The primary goal of a Christian, and if you're not a Christian, you should know this about how Christians are supposed to think. The primary goal of a Christian isn't to get out of the mess, but to follow Jesus. In the mind of a Christian, my primary goal is not how do I get out of the mess. The primary goal is how do I follow Jesus better? How do I obey Jesus better? How do I trust Jesus more? Because as we saw the last couple of weeks, Jesus doesn't work like AAA when you're broken down on the side of the road. We want him to show up, fix everything, and say, we'll call you next time we need you. Jesus said, I'm the light of the world, and if you follow me, you won't walk in darkness, but you will have the light of life. As we follow him, we see the way out of our messes. And David understood my primary goal here is not to get out of the mess. The primary goal is to honor God. So here's what happens. With these words, David rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. And in my notes, I wrote, completely ignorant of what had just transpired and of how close he was to dying on the toilet that day. Then David went out of the cave. Think of this. So he leaves. David goes, whew, but he doesn't let Saul go. Saul climbs back on. He slips back into his saddle. Everyone, they wanted to honk their horns outside, but you don't do that when it's the king, so they're just waiting. Saul slips back into the saddle. They're ready to march out, and as soon as they're ready to march out, David walks out of the cave into the desert sunlight, clutching a piece of cloth in his hand. Okay, think of the power of this moment. And called out to Saul, my Lord the king. And Saul turns around in his saddle and he squints in that bright desert sun and he says, is that who I think it is? And someone near him says, sire, it's King David. And in that moment, every single soldier in that army knew everything that just happened. Every single person in the army understood exactly what just took place in that cave. When Saul looked behind him, look what David did. David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He goes down and he bows low before King Saul. Not saying, you're a bad king. Hey, you're the king. You're the Lord's anointed. So my job is to do the next right thing, and I bow in the presence of the king. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say, 'David is bent on harming you'? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave." At which point Saul realizes and everybody realizes, yes, he did. "Some urged me to kill you. Didn't they, Simon? But I spared you. I said, I will not lift my hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed." So now, at this point, Saul's bodyguards are shifting uncomfortably in their saddles because their job is to protect the king. So David says, I didn't just protect you, I was your bodyguard, and I did their job for them because these guys tried to kill you after I decided I was going to spare you. "See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. Now understand and recognize that I am not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion." Now at this point, there's nothing Saul can do. At this point, Saul realizes, my men might choose to follow David right now, and they might kill me for him after he did that. This is incredible. So Saul recognizes that he is in the wrong. He apologizes to David. He gives the command. The army marches away, and Saul never bothers David again. And just 7 chapters later, Saul is in his chariot, and they're fighting with the Philistines, and a random Philistine arrow pierces Saul's armor, and he dies. And David becomes the next king of Israel. Now, here's what's interesting. As we look at all of this is about a 60-second story. If I had just opened up and said, hey, I'm going to read the story to you, and just read the story from beginning to end, it would have taken about a minute for me to tell you this whole story. To which some of you are thinking, really? A minute, huh? It's in my job description. If it takes a minute to tell, 35 minutes is the goal. It's in my job description. That's what I do. And imagine if at this moment when David is in the cave and he's creeping up on Saul, imagine if somehow suddenly you had a DeLorean or a telephone booth or a time machine that's in a hot tub. Imagine if all of a sudden you could time beam into that cave and say, David, wait a minute. I need to tell you something. I read the rest of your story, and guess what? In 7 chapters, Saul's out of the picture. In 7 short chapters, Saul dies and you become the king. Buddy, you just need to hang in there for 7 chapters. Can you do that? All right, high five. Let him go. All right. But you know what? David didn't have anybody show up in the cave to tell him what was going to happen 7 chapters later in his own story. And neither do you. When you are facing a mess, whether you created it or whether someone else created it, no one's going to show up and tell you, hey, in 7 chapters, here's what happens. So, with whatever mess you're in today, there will be a day in your future when your current mess is nothing more than a 1-minute story from your past that you tell. And some of us have lived long enough to understand how this works, but as painful as this season might be, as difficult as this season might be, as stressful as your mess might be if you are in a mess today or if you're about to step into one, there will be a day in your future when your current mess is nothing more than a story from your past that you tell, and it's going to take about 1 minute to tell your story. And here's how the story is going to begin. 5 years ago, I was looking at an ugly divorce. 2 years ago, I had to drop out of school. 6 months ago, I found out my husband was cheating on me. 7 years ago, I made a horrible mistake and I found out that I was pregnant. 8 years ago, I was an addict with no control of my life. Whatever mess you find yourself in, there will be a point in your future where it is nothing more than a 1-minute story, and I don't know the opening line of that story, but it's going to go something like that. 3 years ago, my marriage was a disaster. Now, what's unique about your story, listen to this, what's unique about your story isn't that you got into a mess. We've said all series long, that's the thing we all have in common. What's unique about the story isn't that you got yourself into a mess. What's unique about your story is how you choose to respond in the middle of your mess. It's how you choose to respond in the middle of the mess that you are in. And are you going to prioritize getting out of your mess at all costs, or are you going to prioritize following Jesus? Are you going to prioritize, I'll fight fire with fire, I'll fight a flood with more water, or are you going to say, I am going to do the next right thing and I'm going to entrust the outcomes to my Father in heaven? Here's the bottom line. It's this right here. The mess you're in isn't as important as your response to your mess. That's what's going to make your story special. That's what's going to make your story unique. That's what has the power to make your story amazing. And isn't that why we're still thinking about the story of David today? It's not because he got into a mess. In the ancient world, to have an insecure king who slaughtered people, who murdered people because he thought they were a threat to his throne, get in line. That's a common story in the ancient world. There's nothing special about that story. What made David's story special and what made him unique was that he chose in that mess to respond in a way that allowed room for God to show up and surprise him. So here's the question, and this is a question, it's a powerful question, and this is a question that will give you so much guidance if you take it seriously in whatever mess you're in. This is a question that if you answer it honestly will give you so much traction in climbing out of whatever mess you are in if you take it seriously. Then here's the question I want you to begin asking whenever you find yourself in a mess. Which story do you want to tell? Which story do you want to tell? Which story do you think David wanted to tell? Imagine his young children and he becomes the king and he's bouncing his young kids on his knee and they say, Daddy, Daddy, tell us the story again of how you became king. Well, kids, one day your grandfather was taking a dump. So I snuck up behind him and slit his throat, and that's how your daddy became the king. Oh, Daddy, you're so brave. You think that's the story he wanted to tell? When you look at the mess that you're in, come on. When you talk to your kids, dads, when you talk to your sons, when you talk to your grandsons, what story do you want to tell? Ladies, when you talk to your daughters, when you tell your story to your granddaughters, what story do you want to tell? Now, I don't know all the circumstances about your mess, but here's what I do know. You're the kind of person that wants to be able to tell the true story. The one where you don't act like a hypocrite. The one where you chose to be courageous. The one where you chose to do the next right thing. The one where you chose to leave space for God to show up and surprise you with His deliverance. That's the story you want to tell. The story you said, I'm going to do the next right thing and I'm going to trust my Father in heaven and I'm going to leave the outcomes up to Him. Now, when David made this choice, he had no idea what was hanging in the balance. Not just the throne, not just the kingship. There was so much more hanging in the balance, and David had no idea what was hanging in the balance of his decision that day. But 1,000 years after David, a man named the Apostle Paul did know what was hanging in the balance. And here's his commentary on David. The Apostle Paul said, after removing Saul, he, God, made David their king. He, God, testified concerning him, David, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. God said, you know what I know about David? He wants to be near my heart. He wants to be close to me. He loves me and wants to do the next right thing because he wants to be close to me. He will do everything I want him to do. From this man's descendants, King David, God has brought to Israel the Savior Jesus as he promised. You see, after David became king, he had a son, Solomon, and that's another mess we'll save for another sermon, another day. And he became king after David, and he had a son who became king. But ultimately, the true son of David, the true king that would save people was the Savior Jesus, the descendant of David who sits on the throne of heaven, the Son of God and the Son of Man. Jesus, the Savior, who when he looks at you in your mess, he does not condemn you. And I don't have time to go back into everything we looked at in this series. I hope you'll watch online. In your mess, whatever mess you've made, he does not condemn you. He forgives you because he's the Savior, and he invites you to follow him out of your mess into a better future of true flourishing, and he invites you to trust him. Some of you would say, Jason, yeah, but you don't know. I had a mess, and then you have no idea how much messier I made it. Yeah, I might not know, but God does. And Savior Jesus gave his life on the cross to pay not just for your mess, but even your decision to make it messier, because he's a God of grace. And when you come to him with your mess, he's not going to scold you. He's not going to shame you. He's going to say, I have grace for you, and I want you to follow me out of your mess. So remember, every mess comes with built-in bad options. Every mess comes with built-in bad options that will make your mess messier, and you have a decision to make. Do I do the expedient thing? Do I do the easy thing? Or do I do the godly thing? And if you want to get clarity on which path to take forward, you need to ask yourself the honest question, which story do I want to tell about this season of life? And your answer is the honest one, the courageous one, and the one that left room for God to show up and surprise you. Now, next week we're going to start a new series called Right in the Eye, and it's actually going to build on this idea and help us with it. How do we live in a culture where everyone tells you to do what David's men told him to do? Just do what's right in your own eye. How do we thrive in a culture like that? That's what we're going to talk about in the next series. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for preserving this amazing story from the life of David. But this is a story that is amazing because not of the mess David was in, but how he chose to respond in that mess. With courage and with trust and with confidence that you are good and the outcomes are in your hands. Our responsibility is to do the next right thing. So, Father, I pray for everyone listening with whatever mess they've found themselves in or whatever guilt they're carrying for making a mess even messier, that they will see today that you are a God of hope, you are a God of grace, and you are a God who loves to lead people out of your messes. So give us courage to trust you and to do the next right thing and leave the outcomes in your hands. Give us the courage to follow. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.